Welcome to the Global Medical Device Podcast, where today's brightest minds in the medical device industry go to get their most useful and actionable insider knowledge, direct from some of the world's leading medical device experts and companies.
Hey guys, are you struggling with regulatory compliance, product development, or clinical investigations? You can say goodbye to headaches with Greenlight Guru, the only quality management software and electronic data capture system built exclusively for medical devices. Streamline your processes, ensure compliance, and get your products to market faster. Join thousands of medtech professionals who trust Greenlight Guru. Are you ready to accelerate your success? Visit greenlight.guru today. www.greenlight.guru. FDA and ISO compliance can be daunting and oftentimes a complex process. Root Quality Systems makes it easy with their comprehensive compliance services. Whether you're preparing for an audit or need help with documenting your design controls, risk management, or quality system, their experienced team is there to support you every step of the way. Visit rootqs.com and achieve compliance together. That's rootqs.com.
And with me today is Laura Maher. Good to have you today, Laura. How are you doing?
I'm doing pretty good. Happy to be here.
Okay, I wanted to talk to you today about product development, specifically about design and development, or what was previously known before QMSR as design controls. And what made me think of this, just for those of you who are listening, on LinkedIn, sometimes I like to put out some polls. And I had a poll that had 364 votes. And the poll was, who should own the design and development documentation for medical devices? And so that documentation, we can read that in a couple different ways. Is that just the documentation? Is it the entire process? I don't want you to read too much into it, but just think, who should own the design and development documentation for medical devices? Most likely the design controls or the trace matrix.
I had kind of a unique experience. I started in quality, and so that's my background, but then I fell into product development, and I was that person responsible for filling out all of that documentation. So I just see a huge value in having ownership with someone who understands what the documentation should look like, but they also need to understand the product development process really well. So I think that's it depends type question for me of like, there's just a lot of nuance that goes into it.
Yeah. Well, and that's what was funny is because when I put this poll up on LinkedIn, I mentioned there were 364 votes. Well, 80% of them said product development. Oh, it's got to be product development. And that's kind of what I was expecting. I was a little surprised that 6% said regulatory affairs and 10% said quality assurance. 4% said others. See the comments. And that's where I saw your comment, which was exactly as you just mentioned. It would be really great if you could find someone who has that PD mindset, but also has the QE or QA experience so that they can have something of a Venn diagram.
Yeah. And I think like for me, I did a course in design controls kind of early in my time there. And that really helped me understand because I would say, product development engineers, and I'm not an engineer by training. And so I think that maybe kind of what made a difference for me is like wasn't fully designing. I was doing the quality engineering type work, helping launch products, helping scale up products, but not necessarily designing the product itself. But I think it's important to understand design controls really well. And I would say that both people on the quality side, if that's solely their focus, or people just on the development side or even in regulatory may not fully understand what's like expected or what the format or the context of the information needs to be in, or kind of like the perspective of just being an auditor and looking at it and trying to understand it. So I think when you can find somebody that can look at all of those perspectives, I think you just overall end up with cleaner documentation. That ultimately our goal for this, I mean, it's not going to regulators. That's not what we submit. It's what auditors look at and what our future engineering teams look at, 10 years down the road when we have all won the lottery. So it's like understanding your audience and presenting it in a way that makes sense for those audiences. And I think that's what's important.
Yeah. And that's a good point, because sometimes we talk around this issue of design controls. The The term that I've really started to adopt for the person who I feel like should own this is the design assurance professional. And so to me, that's a cross pollination of design, product development, someone in design, and someone who has that quality experience. So design assurance, to me, that term kind of encompasses both sets of experience. But maybe what would be beneficial is to talk about what the expectations are for that person, because you mentioned you kind of fell into that role or grew into that role from a different direction than is traditionally expected. What were some of the things that you learned in that design controls course or through experience that really set you up for success, do you feel like?
So I think we spend a lot of time on the definitions of the different design controls, starting with user needs, which if you look in ISO, if you look in the FDA regulations, it's not specifically stated that needs to be a column or like a specific input to your matrix, but it's something that if you use our software, you're familiar with, that's kind of where we start. But there are mentions in both of those documents of user needs are starting with what the patient needs are or the indications for use. So I think really kind of digging into that of you don't you don't engineer and then figure out a use for it. We start with use case, we start with user needs and how to define those within our documentation. And then how do we translate those to workable user needs? How do we realize those and prove that through our outputs? And then a lot of time on verification and validation. These are all like sticky terms for people that don't always make sense of like what falls into verification, what falls into validation. So that course was incredible because it helped me understand what these definitions mean, what are realistic examples in a project or different types of projects. So it just kind of sets you up to just know how to present your project overall.
Yeah.
Right definitions. And when you show that you understand definitions, I feel like that puts auditors a little bit at ease because, you look like you know what you're talking about at least.
Well, I want to emphasize that, maybe go down just a few more steps down that rabbit trail if that's all right. And that is the audience. You mentioned you got to know who your audience is. Maybe it's not necessarily for the regulators. Can you talk a little bit more about that? Who is going to be looking at this design and development documentation, and how should who's it really for?
So it's for, a lot of people in your organization. And from my experience, one of my first projects at my first medical device job outside of quality control was remediating DHFs. And so we were coming into these DHFs a decade after they were created to understand kind of the approach to design. Because there'd been, full team over or team turnover, sorry. And so understanding the design, how they verified things, validated things, tested things. So you got to think about future engineers because this product, we're not designing and creating this documentation just for launch. This is something that lasts the lifetime of your device. And any time that you come back to it to make design changes or make second iterations of it or release product extensions of it, we're coming back to this file and making sure that we're still meeting user needs, still meeting inputs with our changes and documenting those changes within that. So it's really important for your engineers to understand why things happened and why you chose the things that you did. And then also that's the first thing, if you're a design firm or any company that designs medical devices, an auditor comes in, they're going to ask for your most recent design history file. That's going to be the first thing they look at. And I've been in like FDA audit, ISO audits. For FDA, they're going to look at 510K products. We had a mix of 510K and class 1. ISO is just going to look at probably most recent 1 or 2. We have a lot of CMD customers that are coming into the market. And I think a lot of times, they're approaching the design and development with the same process, but a different kind of format, and often wonder what the importance is of this design and development file, including the trace matrix. And it's always to help other people understand your device and your approach to designing it and making sure that it's safe and effective. So I always try to I think getting too technical, I guess, in the wording of some of these documentations can be a little bit of a killer. We've got all of our reports, protocols, data to kind of back that, but our trace matrix and kind of what we present needs to be clean. It needs to be concise and understandable and follow a nice flow as you go through.
Yeah, it's a collaborative document, and I think a lot of the comments in my poll, when I put that on LinkedIn, a lot of the comments kind of spoke to that. Needs to be a collaborative document. Who's going to own it? One of the assumptions we need to tease out when we're talking about who should own something like the design and documentation for a medical device is, what's the purpose of owning it? Is the product development team, they're going to own it for a little while, perhaps because they're designing it. Maybe the quality team is going to take ownership at some point because they're going to be defending it. The regulatory team is going to be taking all this information and building out something to submit. So everybody has a stake in this. As far as ownership goes, who's actually implementing the wording? There's going to be a point man. And in my experience, sometimes it's been the project manager, but maybe they don't really have the medical device experience. They have project management experience, but maybe not the medical device experience. And so when I look at this design assurance professional, I look at it as that is the person who is almost a gatekeeper for the document itself. Yeah. And I'm gonna throw one other person out there, because I mentioned the project manager. They're making sure the project's happening. There's also the project lead, who might be a very experienced engineer who is doing genuine engineering things. They're submersed in CAD, whether it's SolidWorks, Solid Edge, whatever, and they don't really want to do any documentation. That's the personality that you usually have. So those two people are kind of a tug of war for control. One's leading the engineers down the engineering path. One's project management, who's got to report to management. And I almost see this design assurance person as a third person who is almost an interpreter or translator. What are your thoughts?
I agree. I would say it's almost like a technical writer. Like your design assurance person should understand, or I guess be more of a big picture type role, sort of like the project manager, where they kind of have an understanding, or maybe they're involved with more meetings than just engineers or just quality, so that they can stay a part of that big picture and understand what's going on. But again, they need the technical background so that they can write. It depends on what the scope of that design engineer is, or design assurance engineer. Because for me, I was writing all of the documentation because nobody else wanted to write. And I'm somewhat, not to pat myself on the back, I'm fairly good at technical writing. So like it just kind of worked out that way, that I ended up being that person to do all of the documentation. But it's just, someone that can understand the whole project, that can understand the design side, or understand the engineering aspect of it, understand what's going to want to be seen, or have a good understanding of like sampling size, or, maybe even be a bit of a designer or regulatory consultant in that regard, of like knowing the right approach to testing, or maybe what testing needs to get done throughout, and kind of guiding that. So yeah, I could see that being kind of maybe more under project managing, of like being the technical writer, or more involved with the doing than the project manager, I guess.
I was a project manager for a drug delivery combination product, but prior to that, I was working as a project manager, which is how I got my PMP, as a project manager on a regulatory project that had to deal with manufacturing, a lot of regulatory, a lot of purchasing, a lot of quality. And just because we were remediating about 250 class 2 medical devices to make sure that they were UDI compliant with direct part marking. So I say all that to say, I had to meet with a lot of management. I had to make sure we were on timelines and so forth, make sure that we were in the schedule for all the different fixtures that needed to be validated and made and so forth. And I had a right-hand man who was really granular, and without him, it would not have worked. And I almost see him as this design assurance person. He was the one checking every drawing that came through and making sure he had understood the network of traceability that was going to impact every DMR and DHR.
Yeah.
So yeah, that was really helpful, and that's kind of how I see this design assurance person working in medical device companies.
You brought up something DMR. I didn't even think about that, because I was responsible for making sure that happened, because there's so much. I don't know that quality always gets involved with like the DMR, other than it's a quality document that needs to be managed in the quality system, but the details of it. But kind of knowing the structure of what it should look like, the information that goes in there, where to go into the design outputs and verifications to get that information. But yeah, it's just kind of a big coordinated effort, because there's just so much documentation that needs to come out from the design and development file, the DMR, the procedures. I feel like DMR is also a little bit confusing, because DMR is a document. It's a procedure level document, but it's also, to me, a file as well that contains the IQ, OQ, PQs that you did, anything else like that, your procedure list for that particular product. But yeah, there's just a lot. There's a lot that has to get done and has to be coordinated across and match. And
Yeah, QMSR is really going to force us to go global. I think design DMR, it's an acronym that I've liked for a long time. Device Master Record, I believe, correlates to the medical device file, if I'm not mistaken. But I'm putting myself on the spot here when I shouldn't. Why am I doing this to myself for ISO 1345? But you're absolutely right. It's however you look at QMSR. The way I look at it is just reshuffling the deck. Everything that was previously required is still, that all of that information is still going to be required. So that person you mentioned, that design assurance or whoever it is that's pulling that out of the design outputs to turn it into a DMR, or like you said, the file, that's important knowledge. And it's not always knowledge that every project manager is going to be a top of mind for him when he's just thinking, or him or her, or the project engineer who's thinking, we just want the most robust design. This person is forward thinking.
someone, if you could develop a design assurance person, have them be involved at every step of the way. And I think that's kind of the value that I had as I got pulled into a project, and I started at voice of customer stage of like literally going to hospitals, talking to nurses, talking to clinicians, giving them prototypes and doing prototyping myself, and then kind of moving into the scale up of it. And then, the design changes, or they ended up being just a memo to file in that case, like a pretty simple change. And then through launch and marketing it and doing studies with it and things like that, it just gives you a good perspective on who needs to know what and kind of what goes into every single step. And I think you appreciate the design file a little bit more there, because you've been through everything. So it's a little bit easier to tell a story of how we got there. I feel like I'm very lucky in having that opportunity to start beginning to end. I know with larger companies, you do a thing and that's the thing that you do. And I have experience with that too, where it's like your tech file part is hazardous substances. That's what you're going to do. And that's all you're going to do as part of this. So I don't know, if you can get the opportunity to follow something start to finish, it's a really great perspective for creating a solid design file, I think.
Absolutely. And some of these bigger companies, I think Medtronic comes to mind, that I believe have the title design assurance or design assurance manager. They have this specific role that is design assurance. And I'm looking forward to interviewing some of them. I have some of them on my list so that I can get a better sense of what that means for that particular company. I'm sure it obviously varies from company to company. But that's something that you mentioned. Like if you could grow a design assurance professional, how would you do it? Pulling them into every one of those different situations or scenarios, or just following that, I think is a good practice. So yeah, this question, who should own the design and development documentation for medical devices? If you just put that in their hands, would you, maybe we should ask this. Would you put the trace matrix and the risk matrix in that person's hands and say, you own the development of this document?
See, if we're going to bring risk into it, that's a harder question. I think that definitely depends on someone's background with risk management and if they like risk management. Um, so is that risk management is either like, I really feel like it's a love it or hate it type thing. I particularly enjoy it. So I was happy to own. I mean, we were a tiny team. So, I mean, I just did everything anyway. So I don't know. I think that's a tough question of who you put the risk into. I think someone should own it, but risk needs to really be a collaborative process all the way through. It's like where design controls, you can pretty much as a one person, team, just take all the information you're getting and kind of map that out and do design reviews to make sure we agree. I feel like anytime you're building out a risk matrix, that needs to be a conversation and a collaboration and brainstorming type activity, because it's all about creativity and thinking about how everything can go wrong, or how when things are going right, things can still go wrong. So
we talked about definitions at the very beginning, so it might be worth looking at definitions again. Just at this point, when I use the word own, how would I define that? You own the success and the failure. It's really just your responsibility to make sure it happens. I guess that's the way I look at that. And so that design assurance professional doing that job with the design controls. Let me use the example of a project manager. The project manager is responsible for a project, but he doesn't actually, at least in my experience, it seems weird. You feel like you're not really doing a whole lot, because a good project manager is the hub of communication, and they're making sure communication flows. Now, there've been good times that I've seen good project managers, and I've experienced it where I wasn't doing that very well, but they're a hub of communication. And I think this is a similar, they really need to have that experience. So I think I agree with you. I don't know whether I would put that same person as the hub of communication or for risk management at the way they would with design traceability, but I agree. I think both of those should be collaborative documents that multiple people have stakes in, but who is ultimately the hub of communication, they might be different people.
Yeah. And you mentioned the project management thing, and I feel like this person that we're talking about, this unicorn that people need on their team to do their design.
Yes.
With project management, you feel a bad project manager. And then when you're under a good project manager, and not necessarily, some projects are just not everybody's thing, but when you're under a good project manager, things just go smoothly. And a lot of times, if you don't spend time with your project manager, you'd be like, oh, what does this person do? They're the reason that your life is going smoothly, probably. Because they're communicating with everybody and getting all of the updates and keeping you on track and giving you a clear picture of what's happening. So I think there is some project management skill set that would go into being a design assurance person, of like having good communication skills, knowing kind of when to bring resources in, and knowing when it's time to bring the whole team together when it comes to design reviews. I could see that design assurance person maybe pushing when design reviews happen, or seeing kind of good times for that to happen and making sure that gets facilitated, the right people are there, things like that.
Time out for just a second, because you said facilitating when design reviews happen. So I want to ask you your opinion on this. Design reviews versus stage reviews or phase reviews, whichever you want to call it. I have a personal preference on this, and it's actually okay. It's a strong opinions held loosely situations. I don't know if I'd say maybe it's strong opinion held very tightly. I don't know, but design reviews, the way I look at them and define them as a technical review, and if that's how you're using it, I definitely agree. Where that design assurance professional, they really needs to be pushing, hey, we are ready for a technical review in this component of our design. This subassembly is ready. Let's have a technical review. Let's have a design review. Whereas the project manager should be in charge of stage reviews. And that's a company-wide situation where we are going to look at our manufacturing processes. Are all the machines validated? We have an IQ, OQ, PQ on the line. Are we going to do it this way? Have we gotten all of our suppliers vetted out? Are we at the right stage? It's a stage review. Are we moving on to the next stage where we are? But they're two different things that can sometimes be conflated. What are your thoughts?
I would say that they are different things that sometimes coincide. But I would agree. Design review is design focused, except for maybe when you get to design transfer, then I could see that being like a stage review and a design review coming together to make sure, design transfer is happening and that we're coordinated on that front. But yeah, no, definitely different things that can sometimes align.
And, I think maybe this role differentiation or consolidation, however you want to look at it, historically, project manager is doing the role of design assurance unless they've offloaded that to their lead engineer where they're doing the documentation. But ordinarily, at least in my experience, I've seen those two kind of a tug of war with that design control trace matrix. And as a result, each one has their own opinion on when the quote unquote design review should take place. Project manager has his view of company. I'm thinking of a company stage review where everybody needs to be involved, and the lead engineer is thinking, I'm thinking of design review, technical review. So those are kind of a tug of war almost, like, no, it should be this date. No, it should be this date because we're not ready, whatever. If we were able to pull out this third person with design assurance manager and give them specific, hey, these are your responsibilities, this design controls trace matrix, and you work with the project engineer on the risk matrix, however you want to lay that out, where the project manager is again able to focus on that phase type or stage type review, you could almost separate those finally and have two different people responsible for two different types of reviews.
I think it makes sense to me. And I think sometimes people with design reviews, the only requirement is that you have a design review with all the relevant parties. And so that could be your final review that is satisfying the requirement. Any reviews that happen in the middle, those are what's going to be most beneficial for your team and the process to make the project move smoothly, move forward. So I try not to, people get caught up in like, oh, I need to do, 3 throughout the process at this stage and this stage and this stage, or, we got teams doing agile product development now. So that whole stage gate thing doesn't always work for those of us used to waterfall. We might be doing it at the sprint level of doing a design review. So I think it's, don't get too caught up on what a review is called in the middle. You're doing what works best for the team and making sure the project's moving forward and things make sense. And then, sure you have your final design review that's satisfying the requirements.
Yeah. And maybe we should specify what we're talking about when we're talking about design review. When I look at it through the lens of the design assurance professional, I'm thinking of ISO 13485 7.3 clause, where they're talking about the design and development review. All they care about is that we're meeting this regulation. And whereas a project manager, they're thinking, is this thing going to be profitable? If you're gonna machine everything and it's going to be $13 a part, and we plan to sell it for $12 a part, maybe we need to switch to injection molded, or that's what they're thinking about. Whereas the design assurance, hopefully they're thinking from but they're not thinking money. Yeah, just throwing that out there.
Yeah. Well, I think like design review is, I think a lot of times we get too caught up even in like, oh, I got to meet the requirements. But what's the intent behind the requirement? And for design reviews, it's to make sure that we design the right device and we designed it correctly with stakeholders involved and somebody independent from that process involved. And so, yeah, I think especially kind of early in my project experience, the team, we were all pretty fresh to design controls and like feeling like very rigid in the structure of like, oh, we've got to meet all the requirements, but like not really putting a whole lot of thought behind like why are we doing this in the first place, or what is the goal that we're trying to get out of it. So yeah.
No, that's good. That's a good point. A lot of people who do design controls might be doing it for the first time, because I think a lot of innovation happens in these smaller companies that might get bought up by larger companies later on. So yeah, that's
generally my experience, like being an onboard and implementation guru here at Greenlight. I meet with a lot of customers who are approaching this for the first time, and they're very new to all of it, the definitions, the process, design reviews. They're new to everything. And I think that more often than not, that's going to be kind of what's happening with teams, is that, except for the very, very large corporations like Stryker or Medtronic that are, well-oiled machines.
Well, yeah, I don't know. I almost have a flip. I almost have a flip side. And I don't want to poke fun at anybody, but some of the experience I've had with some of the larger companies is that they're rigid in a different regard, in that they're focused on, this is how it's always been done. This is how I learned it. Whereas, well, is that actually required? So I mean, they could both have their pros and cons. Not to, yeah, no, I know what you mean though.
But I think it's like, if you're fresh to it, I think that, it can be really scary to be like, oh God, I've got to get this right. But like, I think it's bringing in the spirit of quality and innovation to the process. And if you know what the standards and regulations require, they're not constrictive. They're just telling you how to make sure that you're doing it right. And that you go into the design process with that of like, I'm making a safe device and I'm making an effective device, and it's got to be something that's feasible to manufacture so that I can make sure that it can be delivered to people. But also from the perspective of like, I'm creating this documentation from the start so that my engineers 10 years down the road understand my thought process today, and that when regulators or standard bodies come to my organization, I can communicate this effectively to them.
Yeah.
For startup companies, like having that spirit, I think is just as important as like knowing the definitions of everything and having that experience.
The why behind why are we doing this? Yeah. Not just arbitrary set of rules. Standard, it's interesting. We use that word in industry so often that I think we forget how it is used outside industry. If you think, oh, this is the standard, this is the baseline expectation that is pretty universal. I mean, that's kind of, if you look at the definition of the word standard, I mean, I keep going back to definitions. What am I doing? You just said, well, let's focus on the spirit, which I agree.
Well, you have to know to focus on the spirit, you have to know the definition.
Right.
But we don't want to get too caught up in the definition or feel like it's constricting. I mean,
know the why. Know the why.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. And the why, have that quality mindset, have that, why are we here mindset? We're improving patient quality of life. And so I think even like when you're talking about bigger corporations, we get too caught up in our specific role and making sure that we're doing the process exactly how it's been done for the past 10 years, 20 years, and kind of losing that spirit of quality and innovation as we go through.
Well, I'll put a link in the show notes to my poll. It was a couple weeks ago, maybe months by the time you've gotten this, but I would love to hear anybody's additional thoughts. If you want to go to the link at LinkedIn to let me know what you think, who should own the design and development documentation for medical devices? Are you in that 17% that thinks it's someone other than product development? Or do you disagree in any way? I'd love to hear what your thoughts are. Or if you have thoughts on this design assurance professional, I think it's going to be an potentially emerging role in the future. The larger companies have already adopted it. So I'd be curious to see how
I think I've started seeing that role like more recently, at least like maybe in the last 5 to 10 years, of that being a role that's actually advertised versus, just quality engineer.
Yeah.
But you don't see it across all organizations. Part of that is probably size. It's kind of hard to justify just one person who's like owning that when you have a small team. It's going to be like you said, project manager is design assurance engineer as well.
There's some people who probably reach out and say, well, I've seen a design assurance role for the last 50 years. So yeah, maybe I've been living under a rock, but I'd love to hear what anybody's thoughts are. Any last thoughts, piece of advice for people owning, whoever it is that owns their design controls, trace matrix, design and development process, whatever it's called now with QMSR?
I think seeking out training, talking to other people in industry gives you that confidence and understanding of what needs to happen, what needs to be documented, how it needs to be documented. Participate in audits. When you get to see firsthand what your auditor is asking for and looking at, and the questions that get generated from that documentation really helps too. Like I start to think about like, how can I keep someone from asking a question in the documentation, or how can I explain it in a way that we're not creating rabbit holes? Not that we shouldn't be scared of that, but we also kind of, the goal is to keep people from getting too deep into everything. So just try to get those different perspectives, see if you can participate in other parts of the product development process and have an open mind. And
yeah, it's maybe we'll kind of just throw a few things out there as we kind of close, but you got me thinking about what are the skills needed for this. If I'm going to go out and hire a design assurance professional, what are the skills needed to fulfill this role? If I just kind of repeat back to you what I've already heard you say, some of the project management skills, communication skills, and ability, organization, the technical writing, and the ability to actually document those things. But you also mentioned going out and seeing voice of the customer. So being able to take go to those meetings, take all of that information and compile that. Maybe that's more of that technical writing skill and the ability to do that. But then the last thing I would say is a knowledge of the standards and regulations. Curiosity about why is this a rule? Is this a rule? And why is this a rule? Anything to add?
No, I think all of that is good. Maybe a little bit of engineering background. Like I said, I'm not an engineer, but spending time with engineers, understanding what their challenges are in terms of like cost and supplier management and things like that. But yeah, I think it's one of those things, like bioengineers in and of themselves, which I'm not one, but it's kind of like a multidisciplinary subject of learning a little bit of everything so that we can be effective in these types of like design assurance type roles. But kind of having that spirit of learning and growing and flexibility. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Laura. I really appreciate it. We'll put a link in the show notes if you want to find out how to get a hold of Laura. And thank you so much. I already asked you last words. I'll ask you one last time. Any last things that you want to point people to or anything like that?
I think we have an ultimate guide to bringing a medical device to market. And that document is really incredible because we're looking at bringing a device to market from a lot of different perspectives in that. I think Tom Risch is our guru author on that one. I think it's a really great place to go if you're new to design and development.
Fantastic. I'll put a link to that in the show notes as well. All right. Thank you so much, Laura. Really appreciate you being on the show. We'll let you get back to it. Cass, thank you for listening, and we will see you all next time. Take care.
Thank you so much for listening. If you enjoyed this episode, can I ask a special favor from you? Can you leave us a review on iTunes? I know most of us have never done that before, but if you're listening on the phone, look at the iTunes app, scroll down to the bottom where it says leave a review. It's actually really easy. Same thing with the computer. Just look for that leave a review button. This helps others find us, and it lets us know how we're doing.
Also, I'd personally love to hear from you on LinkedIn. Reach out to me. I read and respond to every message because hearing your feedback is the only way I'm going to get better. Thanks again for listening, and we'll see you next time.